This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Welcome back, everyone, to World to Win. My name is Toya, part of the International Socialist Alternative. Be sure that you're subscribed to our channel so you can stay up to date. And I just want to remind everyone that we do have our World to Win YouTube show on podcast version. So if you're the type of person that can't sit in front of the screen all day, you want to listen while you work, make sure you search World to Win on however you listen to your podcast. Today, we have an extremely important and up-to-date episode about what's going on in Israel Palestine. Now, it is May 21st right now that we're filming, so things may have changed by the time you hear this episode, but I'm sure all of it is still relevant. We're filming as a ceasefire has just been agreed upon, that was brought to us from this extremely terrible, bloody phase of warfare against the Palestinian people. And I'm sure if you're watching this, you're aware of what's going on, and maybe you too have even participated in protests or meetings around this issue. So if you have, please put a comment on the video and let us know what the protests were like in your city. But last weekend, there was a day of rage against the, bloodbath of the Palestinian people. But we also saw a huge general strike, which is extremely exciting from the Palestinian workers. And there were massive protests in communities around the world, in Jordan and Lebanon. And it's not the first time that we've seen things like this happen. There's been a decades and decades long cycle of deadly bloodshed, which has been fueled by global imperialism and capitalism, which, the details we're going to get into here with our two guests today. This round of warfare, we saw the deaths of over 200 Palestinians, workers and children alike. And also on the other side, we saw 11 Jews, Arabs, and migrant workers that were killed by rocket fire from Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. But in the International Socialist Alternative and everyone who's involved with our organization and World to Win, we have been out in the streets protesting, to talk about what we can do to stop the killing, stop the bloodshed. Like I said, we're going to get into the details a little bit further today. So for me here in Boston, we've had a few protests that have been extremely inspirational and really, putting our President Joe Biden to the test. This is kind of the first time since he's become president that the left is really attacking what he's doing. And so it's been interesting to see these types of discussions happen in the protests. But here today, I want to introduce our guests. We have two members of the International Socialist Alternative located in Israel Palestine. There, we're called Socialist Struggle Movement, and we have Tuval and Yasha here with us today. So Tuval, you first. How have you been?
I've been okay, all things considered. Just, trying to protest terrible things our government is doing.
Well, I'm glad to see you safe and here with us today. And thank you for taking the time to talk with us. I know it's probably crazy and there's so much stuff going on. Yasha, what have you been up to today?
Yes, we are also preparing for a participation of another anti-occupation protest that will take place tomorrow evening on the eve of Saturday, and organizing for that.
That's super exciting. So let's get right into the questions, Yasha, because I'm sure people who are watching and listening want to know some of the, on the ground experience that you're able to give us here today. And I'm assuming that people, again, who are watching have a basic knowledge. I mean, even people, who aren't paying attention know what's going on. It's been worldwide news. But because it's been worldwide news, we know that a lot of the propaganda that has been put out has caused actual confusion into what is truly going on in Israel Palestine. But like I said, we have reports of a ceasefire. So Yasha, can you tell our viewers what is happening right now in Gaza?
Yeah, so obviously there is a sense of relief among millions of Palestinians and of Israelis after the end of the horrific bombardment on Gaza and the firing of rockets of the last 11 days with the announcement of the ceasefire. And immediately after it was announced, Palestinians actually took to the streets in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank during the night to celebrate the fact that they managed to stand their ground against the barbaric attacks of the Israeli army. And this yesterday night's protest, they are coming after weeks of popular mobilizations of tens of thousands in all of the Palestinian communities for protest actions, demonstrations, marches, strike actions, and civil disobedience. So this is an initial stage of a new uprising of the Palestinians led by the youth, and it will not be simply stopped now because of the announcement of a ceasefire. But the ceasefire is also not the end of hostilities. The morning after the ceasefire, Israeli forces again attacked worshippers in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, in occupied East Jerusalem. So by the ceasefire, the occupation in the West Bank obviously continues. So it continues also in East Jerusalem, and the expansion of the colonial settlements continues, and the siege on Gaza will continue in this view, not allow also a real reconstruction of the destruction that was caused by these 11 days of war, which were a real nightmare in the Gaza Strip with, as you said already, Toya, more than 213 Palestinians were killed. 65 of them, at least 65 of them, were children. More than 90,000 people become refugees. 1,000 buildings were destroyed, and this is including also whole apartment blocks. The collapse of one of those blocks killed 42 people. There were like whole families that were buried under the rubble. Whole families were perished. And we heard some really heartbreaking reports from the Gaza Strip of families that, they slept together in the same room during the bombardments because they have no place to run, to escape, even no shelters. And they prefer to be in one room. So if in the worst case scenario, a bomb would hit them, no child would be left as an orphan. So it's really horrible situation. And besides of the attacks on those apartment blocks, so we saw how towers that house media organizations were targeted, hospitals were targeted. There was even an attack on a laboratory that was the only laboratory in the Gaza Strip that was processing COVID-19 tests. And these are all acts of state terrorism. Yes, this is what it is. And I would say the obvious, that these acts of state terrorism are not meant to protect the Israeli public, who is generally threatened by rocket fire. And also in Israel, children and elderly were killed last week. But the Israeli bombardments, they have nothing to do with security. Those military attacks are meant to, in fact, protect the capitalist status quo of occupation, siege, national discrimination, divide and rule between workers, and poverty, and this is what it is.
The story you just said, Yasha, about, families staying in the same room, to sleep in case something happens so that children wouldn't be left as orphans is just, it's heartbreaking. I mean, to have to, go through this, it's heartbreaking is all I can say. But could you go a little bit further into, why all of this actually began? Because, if we're just relying on the corporate media, sometimes we're getting one side of the story.
Yes, the side of the Israeli regime, of the Israeli ruling class. But basically, let's start with the fact that for the Palestinians, life under the occupation or under the siege on Gaza is a non-stop violence. Yeah, this is what it means. And this is also include grotesque levels of poverty and unemployment. And during the pandemic, the last year, this became even worse, with real threat of hunger during the lockdowns for Palestinian families. So, 1 month ago, the Muslim holiday of Ramadan began, while families were in real economic distress. And on top of that come police provocations in East Jerusalem against Muslim worshippers in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So these are worshippers that are coming from the East Jerusalem neighborhoods, but also, from the West Bank and from other areas. And all of them were attacked by stun grenades, rubber bullets, and by horrific police brutality. And in the same time, in the area of the mosque, there is also a public area, a public square, when at the gates of the old city, when the Palestinian youth, they are gathered during the Ramadan months to break the fast and to hang together. So this year there was an actual decision by the Israeli police tops not to allow them to gather. And it's become like a scene of protest and clashes when the Palestinian youth, they were not ready to just to obey to these restrictions. But on top of that, there was also the strengthening of the far right in Jerusalem and elsewhere by the Netanyahu regime, by his electoral tactics that actually promoted a neo-fascist Kahanist member of parliament to be in parliament for the first time ever. And this was seized upon by the far right to increase their presence on the streets with daily attacks, violent attacks against the Palestinians. And on top of that, you have also the eviction of the residents in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem, who are now being threatened to be removed from the houses they lived in for their whole lives in favor of settlers, far-right Kahanist settlers. So if you look in the combination of that, so there is so many provocations coming in such a short space of time, and nothing of this is accidental, because the government is involved in any of those, decisions by the police, decisions of what to do in Sheikh Jarrah. And what we saw also is the resistance of the youth that really grow from one day to another, for 1 week to another, with bigger and bigger mobilizations and really popular protests developing. So the Palestinian youth, they actually managed to make the tops of the police to zigzag and to cancel the restrictions of movements in these gates of the old city where they are gathering. And they are also managed to get the armed forces out of the mosque compounds. And then they moved with all these newly achieved victories to help the residents of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in their struggle. And they came every night to be with them, to show solidarity, to protest with them. And then it was answered again with a horrific police repression and arrests of hundreds of youth almost every day, up until it came to the point when there was a going on movement from below. And this movement also tried to block the far-right march that was organized last week. And on the background of that, Fatah and Hamas, the Palestinian, the two biggest Palestinian parties, which was in control of the Palestinian Authority, and the other one locally in the Gaza Strip. So they tried to intervene inside this movement. They did not initiate it. They did not start it. Those protests, they were organized, in a semi-spontaneous fashion, but obviously they want to gain some ground. So for the Fatah, it was a total failure, because they did not made any impression on those youth with the empty diplomatic gestures. But Hamas promised to protect the youth against police brutality and to protect the residents of Sheikh Jarrah with military actions. I mean, obviously, the Palestinians have a right to self-defense, and this is including self-defense with arms in hand against the lethal military and police repression. But they discriminate in firing of rockets by the Hamas actually played into the hands of Netanyahu to step up repression and to launch a military offensive against the Gaza Strip. Those rockets also helped the Netanyahu government to mobilize support within the Israeli society because of the security fears that exist in such situation. But albeit the repression and albeit the situation changed from a popular struggle to a real, eruption of war, the protests on the ground continued and the mobilization continued with small steps of civil disobedience by the youth, etc.
There's so much to unpack here, Yasha, and as you're describing, it's not just black and white, right? We have to understand, the desire to for people to defend, but also we don't want to play into the, as you said, play into the hands of Netanyahu and the right wing. It seems extremely complicated, so I'm very glad that you're here to explain it for us. So I want to go to Tuval. Tuval, I remember in 2014 when there were struggles happening in the area back then, and I remember being out and protesting around these issues of what was going on in Gaza specifically. And we've seen over, the past several years, many one-sided wars. But can you explain what the difference is between 2014 and what we're seeing today?
Yes. Well, I think what happened in 2014, the devastation that it brought on Gaza, I mean, that's a similarity, I guess. But when we're talking about the differences, I think that the differences in period, in the kind of the era in which we're in, are very striking. And the things that Yasha was talking about earlier, about the positive developments, about the victories and the popular uprising of Palestinian masses, this was something that didn't happen and on the same scale at all in 2014. And I want to talk about that a little bit more because, so as Yasha has mentioned, in the days before the war that was waged by the Israeli regime move to Gaza, we saw a heroic mass movement of Palestinian youth in East Jerusalem. And it's a dialectical process, I think, because these developments of mass struggle are extremely important, and the fearlessness that Palestinian youth have shown, their determination to struggle, the rise in confidence, thanks to the gains that were made, are all very positive elements. And they also echoed, by the way, things that happened after 2014. There was a mass protest movement in 2017, also against police repression and provocations made by the Israeli regime in Al-Aqsa, and that movement won in 2017. And these gains that were made back then, the achievements were actually lessons for the movement now. Maybe I'll have time to talk about it more later, but I will also say that this follows a mass movement of Palestinian people in 48 borders against police, against violence within Palestinian society, which was hit very hard also in 48 borders by the COVID-19 crisis. But yeah, so the Palestinian youth that were mobilized during these mass demonstrations actually moved on to protesting in East Jerusalem. And so Yasha mentioned how reaction reared its ugly head and the brutal attacks on Gaza and Al-Aqsa, and how I mean, and it actually also led to protests in Palestinian cities and communities all around the area. So also in 48 borders around the country, and in the West Bank, of course, and also in Jordan and Lebanon. And I just want to mention, because I think that as I said before, it's dialectical. There was a very negative but both positive development when these protests that were, again, fearlessly Palestinian youth were out on the streets protesting, and these protests were brutally oppressed by Israeli police. When every Palestinian form of protest is answered by oppression and framed as riots in the Israeli media and all of that. And the police actually forcefully intervened and caused these protests to turn into clashes. And provocations that caused violence, as well as the far right, which, as Yasha said, has been strengthened by Netanyahu in these elections, and it took this opportunity to fuel hate and instigate against Palestinians and be violent towards them in mixed cities as well, and settlers in mixed cities who are ideological agents whose aim is to sow discord between Jews and Palestinians, organized violence against Palestinians in cities. So this is a negative development. The police, the far right, being emboldened to oppress in Lida, actually, 2 settlers shot a young Palestinian man dead. A few days later, buses of settlers from the West Bank organized a pogrom against Palestinian residents. These are elements which we've seen in 2014, but not in the same way, with dozens of lynches across the country. And the police was not only attacking protests, also arrested dozens of Palestinian activists, and stood by when the violence was directed towards Palestinians, even protecting settlers who were attacking in some places. So this, everything that I just said is like unprecedented negative developments. And it actually, the degradation to violence caused also attacks against Jewish residents in mixed cities, when Jewish businesses, synagogues were burnt. Jewish people were also lynched in cities. And and mixed communities will actually have to recover now from these clashes and restore trust between neighbors and residents. But again, dialectical. Remarkably, this extremely negative development was answered with an extremely positive one, which is a movement of solidarity all over the country between Jews and Palestinians, starting with initiatives from below in mixed workplaces, such as hospitals, protests all over the country under the title Jews and Arabs Refuse to be Enemies, opposing violence, for living in coexistence within communities. Unions, such as the Social Workers Union, issued statements of solidarity, and the level of shock from violence ended up creating enough public pressure to force right-wing politicians, even including hypocritically politicians from the far right, to also condemn violence. And also corporations have took this on and started campaigns, under these slogans. And all of this happened at the same time as the war waged on Gaza, when usually when these things, rounds of bloodshed happen in Jewish Israeli society, nationalism and racism resurface. We've seen this, but at the same time, we've seen a mass display of solidarity between Jews and Palestinians. And this was not the only possible scenario. So while remaining a very general message of coexistence, not a mass movement opposing the war, but a mass movement opposing violence towards neighbors, their co-workers, stuff like that, it's still a sentiment of people working and living together, and it's still a very important and positive development.
I love the word that you used a few times there, Tuval, which is solidarity. It's so extremely important. And you mentioned the mass movements of Palestinian youth, which is coming off this year, really, of worldwide, youth in struggle, whether it be against environmental destruction, police brutality, and oppression, like we're seeing in Palestine. It's extremely inspiring. But also there was that one-day general strike, which is really encouraging. There's this article, Tuval, that's being passed around, at least here in the U.S. on social media, that said something like, almost 60,000 construction workers didn't show up to work and cost the capitalists $40 million. And as a construction worker myself, Tuval, I felt so proud of the stance that people took and the acknowledgement that, we're not going to go and make you money while you are destroying our community and killing us. So can you describe a little bit more about that? And also, what is it going to take really for, a movement to be built to make the actual difference that we need going forward?
So the heroic mass movement of youth actually went forward and moved forward, and 3 days before this Palestinian general strike, which was called the Strike of Dignity, there was a mass demonstration held in Sachin in the north of Israel, and the High Follow-Up Committee declared a general strike following this mass demonstration. This was last Tuesday. It's not the first time that such a strike has been declared in the past few years. It's important to say, but this time the response was incredible. And as you said, seeing empty construction sites. By the way, I was seeing a video of probably a Jewish construction worker filming it and saying we should learn from them, see how everybody, how everybody's striking and doing it together. Yasha and I actually went to a protest in Jaffa on the day of the strike. It wasn't just a strike, people staying at home, not working. It was a day of action. And on the way to where the demonstration was held, we saw the streets were completely empty, businesses closed. And as I said, protests were held during the day around the country. And I do have to say that this strike was answered with incitement in the Israeli media from the Israeli regime, calling it like support of terrorism, and the same corporations and managements which allowed and initiated the solidarity messages actually went against the strike when businesses threatened to fire workers who striked. And this shows how unreliable such capitalist forces are and struggle against racism and for coexistence and peace. We, with our small forces in the Socialist Struggle Movement, we tried our best to counter this. So, for example, in Tel Aviv University, where I studied, our position and cooperation with other left forces on campus helped us create a letter of solidarity with the strike. More than 150 students, both Palestinian and Jewish students, signed this letter. And we connected it to the solidarity movement, the Jewish Arab solidarity movement against racism and violence, and saying that this is the correct way to talk about solidarity with the strike, solidarity with the fight against the occupation and the siege. This is the real solidarity against racism and violence. And until now, which is the time of filming, the follow-up committee hasn't declared another day of action. But the incitement against the strike, the attacks against those who striked, shows that the one-day strike action cannot be isolated. There needs to be momentum built to continue this struggle. And as Yasha said before, now after the ceasefire, the siege isn't going away, the occupation isn't going away. But the movement is also not going anywhere. And I think that today, on Friday, we saw mass protests in the West Bank as well as in Al-Aqsa. Yasha has mentioned this. This is really where things are going forward.
Super inspiring, Tuval. I love that you're, talking about, students banding together to talk about what solidarity means and how we can use solidarity to build movements going forward. I want to switch a little bit to talk about some of the, world leaders in the international community. As I said earlier, this was really one of the first times that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in the U.S. has really pressured Biden to, do something different than what he was planning on doing. World leaders around the world, obviously around the world, but support the Israeli state oftentimes and don't speak out enough against the atrocities of the Israeli government on the Palestinian people. What, in your opinion, is really motivating these governments and world leaders? And how do people see the role of Western governments on the ground in Israel Palestine?
Like you say, Western regimes have been backing the Israeli regime's brutality towards Palestinian people for decades, and Netanyahu's reckless and brutal policies, which serve the settler agenda, are actually problematic for at least some of these Western regimes. However, they prefer backing his government's policies, as the Israeli state is an important asset to them in preserving imperialist interests in the Middle East. And seeing this, the hopes that the UN or governments or international forces would help have certainly for many Palestinians been shattered, especially the Trump era, which gave tailwind to Netanyahu's regime and to right-wing forces, the settlers, with actions such as moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And yet, as you say, increased pressures have been building during the past few days for a ceasefire. So how did this happen? Well, our viewers probably know that across the world, a mass solidarity movement developed with the Palestinian struggle. And it changed everything. These movements, mass protests, actions of unions and students in many countries, the attention brought on social media to what's happening first in Sheikh Jarrah and then in Gaza. And, even celebrities such as Lizzo or Natalie Portman expressing solidarity generated a strong public pressure on Western regimes. And it caused them to pressure the Israeli state to agree to a ceasefire after refusing one for the past week. Definitely international solidarity initiatives and protests have an effect. And the ceasefire shouldn't be the end of the solidarity movement. As Yasha said earlier, in Gaza, buildings need to be rebuilt, medicines need to be administered. And while the siege is imposed, the ability to do all that is seriously impaired, as well as the ongoing humanitarian crisis, which was terrible before it has been made worse, with almost all of the water in Gaza being undrinkable and stuff like that. And the occupation and ethnic cleansing continues, as well as the police and armed forces oppression, demonstrations that were oppressed today in the West Bank and Al-Aqsa show. So we need to continue the momentum. We need to raise awareness to what's happening, to mobilize, create more pressure wherever we can and wherever we are. And internationally, this can definitely, as I said, make a big difference.
Thanks so much, Tuval. So I want to go back to Yasha. Viewers may remember that we've had Yasha on our show before. And when you were on World, when you were talking about the normalization process in the region. So I'm curious how the events that have happened over the past month are affecting this normalization process.
It's obviously have and will have lasting effects. Back then, when the war on war to win, we were speaking about the fact that this normalization process were falsely represented by Netanyahu, Trump, and some of the Arab regimes that were involved in them as a peace agreements, but they were not about peace. It was very cynical deals to serve geopolitical interests and different business interests of the corrupt elites in the region. And we also emphasized that those so-called peace agreements would not reduce potential for further bloodshed in the region, as was just proved in a very horrific way in the past couple of weeks. And for the Netanyahu regime, the aim of those agreements was to whitewash and cover up the occupation and the national oppression of the Palestinians, to basically isolate the Palestinian struggle also in the regional level. But the huge wave of solidarity that we see now also in the Middle East shows that Netanyahu failed with this aim. And we saw now, as already been mentioned also by Tuval, protests of Palestinian refugees on the borders of Lebanon and Jordan. This was the biggest such protest held on Nakba Day since 2011. And this is not an accident, because in 2011, this took place on the background of the revolutionary wave that swept the Middle East and North Africa with the revolutions in Tunisia and the toppling of the regime of Mubarak in Egypt. And now what we see is that many of the countries and areas when there were significant mobilization for protests are also places when there were mass struggles during 2019 and 2020. And this includes Tunisia and Iraq. And this development, it points also to the fact that the Palestinian struggle for liberation is actually part of a regional struggle against the imperialist order, against corrupt elites, against the whole system of oppression that is being administrated in the Middle East, and for a real revolutionary change in the way society is organized.
Thanks so much, Yasha. So I want to talk a little bit about Netanyahu, because right now he's experiencing a political crisis. He is, correct me if I'm wrong, the longest serving prime minister ever in Israel's history, but he's in a very weak position right now. So Tuval, could you explain a little on how that's connected to what we're seeing happening today?
These actions, the brutality by Netanyahu's government does not come from a place of strength. And as you said, he's in the weakest position he ever was after 2 years of deep political crisis. And this year saw mass movements. Some of them actually gained certain, I just need to start from the top. Sorry. It's getting late and then, Anyway, okay. So, as you said, Netanyahu is in the weakest position he ever was after 2 years of deep political crisis, and the attacks and the brutality that we've seen do not come from a place of strength. This year saw mass movements, both a movement against Netanyahu and the corruption charges, but also the policies that he's led for the past 10 years he's been prime minister, and as well as the feminist movement and workers' struggles in healthcare, welfare, and education especially. And as I mentioned earlier, the protest movement against gun violence within Palestinian society in the 48 borders. And all these have a definite connection to what's going on now, and also to what kind of what we as socialists think can be done to work here within Jewish Israeli society as well as Palestinian society to fight against Netanyahu's regime and his horrible policies. And I think that we've seen interesting developments as well that have to do with this, or the movement against Netanyahu, which includes different elements. So liberals opposing corruption, but also new angry layers of Jewish youth, unemployed due to the COVID-19 crisis, who for the first time experienced police brutality firsthand. And they actually began organizing in new groups, not only around issues like Netanyahu's corruption charges, but also around feminist issues, climate, police brutality. And significantly, we saw these layers in Sheikh Jarrah and in protests against the war in Gaza, and it shows the potential of radicalizing during a time of political, financial, social crisis that COVID-19 caused. And struggles of workers, healthcare workers, such as nurses, doctors, intern doctors, social workers, are struggles of both Palestinian and Jewish workers together. Palestinian workers striked in hospitals, for example, just a few days before everything started, together with Jews against harsh working conditions. And now, during the general Palestinian strike, Palestinians who chose to strike suffered from backlash from hospital management, and conversations naturally develop amongst workers. So it's definitely a development that needs to be taken into consideration. And the feminist movement against violence towards women, where Palestinian women are disproportionately murdered as a result of domestic violence, saw actually unprecedented involvement of Jewish and Palestinian women struggling together for the past few years, and it marked radicalization among certain layers of young women. And we also saw in the past few days, with the rise in violence, a rise in domestic violence and murders of women, Palestinian women as well. And this movement is not going anywhere, just like other movements for Palestinian liberation isn't going anywhere. And the deep political crisis in the Israeli regime and the consequences of COVID-19 crisis, which hit hard communities here, is created an unprecedented level of distrust in establishment parties and politicians, when the brutal attacks and war instigated by Netanyahu's government, while supported by almost all parts of Israeli establishment parties, definitely had also to do with his weaknesses and the prospects of him losing power. So where usually the situation here among Jewish society is to initially support the Israeli government when leading such wars, with time questions usually start to rise, and the levels of distrust now mean that these questions started rising earlier than usual. People took note, not everybody, certain layers have took note that these brutal attacks and provocations and war waged on Gaza by Netanyahu's government is happening when, as I said, when he's on the brink of losing power, which isn't a sure thing, but he's definitely, as I said, like in a very, very weak position. And most likely that we're going to go to a fifth round of elections in the past 2 years. So we as socialists need to point out not only Netanyahu's part in the horrifying bloodshed and violence we've seen, the entire political system and its policies, and we need to point towards the deep-rooted issues which are already starting which are already rose to the surface, and definitely the rifts and question marks that this deep crisis has brought have potential to radicalize broader layers also of Jewish Israeli youth.
Love hearing about feminist movements, Tuval, Palestinian women and Israeli women fighting together, against sexist oppression. It's super inspiring. So I want to end today with Yasha. I think our viewers and our listeners are very eager to know, what is the way forward for the struggle on the ground, with the Palestinian workers and youth.
Yeah, so I think the most urgent thing now is to take the struggle further. Yes, with organizing more demonstrations, more marches, more strikes, more actions of civil disobedience. And for that, there is also a need of establishment of new democratic action committees or defense committees, some of them already being established. And it's also raised the question of self-defense. There is a need of self-defense in the face of lethal repression. But the question of how to defeat the Israeli military and army machine is not primarily a military question. It's a question of a political struggle, and it's a question of a political strategy and the program that is needed to overcome the national oppression and the social misery.
Absolutely. You mentioned, in Palestine and in Israel, we need that sustained movement, and internationally, we've seen millions of people around the world, marching and protesting in solidarity. And so that type of movement absolutely needs to continue. So I want to ask you now, though, what is the solution that the International Socialist Alternative puts forward for the situation in Israel Palestine?
Yeah, so for us, it's obvious with everything that's been said in this program that the struggle against the occupation and the national oppression of Palestinians is linked to the struggle against capitalism and imperialism in the region. And what we will see in the next couple of days is Biden or the European Union will try to intervene into this new situation with renewed proposals for negotiations about the so-called two states solution. It's the similar two states imperialist plans that were dictated to the Palestinians in the last 2 decades or even 3 decades without any resolutions. So never offered to the Palestinians anything resembling genuine national liberation from the oppression by the Israeli state. And the Israeli ruling class will continue to resist as much as he can substantial concession, obviously on the more sensitive questions like the refugees' rights. But it is also would be completely misleading to think about any kind of political or legal resolution that is not connected to the social social issues and to the social fabric. Without really expropriating the Israeli ruling class, which stands behind the regional military machine, without using resources in the region democratically to end poverty and the massive material inequality between the two national groups, there can be no path for genuine liberation and also for a resolution of this conflict. So the solution is only possible as part of of a regional movement for transformation, for a socialist transformation of the whole region. But on the other hand, we cannot be only abstract about it. Yes, and we need to be more concrete, because millions of Palestinians are now aspire for national liberation and for an independent state, for total independence from Israel. For example, the struggle in East Jerusalem against the colonial settlements, it's a struggle to push them out and not to integrate within the Israeli state, but on the other side, just to achieve a total independence and to push out the military forces, the Israeli police, the settlers. In parallel, millions of Jews will furiously resist any arrangement that, in their view, will not guarantee them national self-determination. And this is an important factor, because a class appeal to Jewish working class, also on the background of what Tuval described in her last contribution, is necessary to end the ability of the Israeli state to mobilize the Jewish part of the population against the Palestinians. And therefore, in these circumstances of conflict and deep divide, we need a program that calls for two equal democratic socialist states in a voluntary confederation with two capitals in Jerusalem, to point the way to address the current suspicions on the both sides of the national divide, and to allow the potential collaboration in struggle of workers and poor to effectively undermine and challenge the Israeli ruling class.
Thank you so much, Yasha. And as you described, it's a complicated situation. It's not just some easy, solution, this or that, like the ruling class likes to put forward. What we're calling for is a socialist solution, because any sort of solution, under capitalism, dealt with through imperialism, is going to lead to more problems or a continuation of the oppression of Palestinian people. So I want to thank you, Yasha and Tuval, for joining us today. This has been an extremely important discussion, and I encourage everyone who's watching to check out the International Socialist Alternative website. That way you can read our up-to-date material. We have interviews with people on the ground in Israel, Palestine, so you can find out, and learn more about what's going on. So I want to thank you both for joining us today. Now it's time for the shout out of the week. And this week we are sending solidarity to the uprising in Colombia. For more than 3 weeks, workers and young people have been hitting the streets, an actual open rebellion against the neoliberal policies. It's been a historic event. The movement continues and it intensifies despite deep, brutal repression. Dozens of people have been killed. People are disappeared. The situation is extremely intense. So the International Socialist Alternative has set up a social media initiative. We have pages on Facebook and also Instagram. And so socialists internationally are encouraged to offer, messages and support of solidarity to the movement. And so you can find those links on your screen below, or you can check it out in the description of the podcast. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, leave me a comment, and we'll see you all next week, same time, same place.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!